good. I'm glad.
You're welcome.
Glad somebody here.
All right, come on, Papa. Hey, that's where
What do you want to do when there's that much smoke in a room? You want to get low, right? You want to stay low to the ground and crawl to the door.
I'm stupid.
No, you stay low. If you get high like this, you can't see anything. So we get low. Oh well.
I can see. And then
crawl over to
I
the
can
door.
see that door. I can see that door. I can see everything.
There we go. All the way out. Watch your step there.
Thank you.
No problem.
You want to go to Chris's house and get a different pair of pants and come back and play here? Yeah, we gotta go get
I messed up.
Car drove by, so we didn't know. And what was that?
Ragland Road.
What is it called?
Ragland Road.
Ragland Road.
And every time I play this, I think of this one road I used to walk down in Gladwin County. It was just a little road, real pretty, soft.
And it
Just
reminds
like
you
this
of the song.
Yeah, I play it, my mind goes to that road.
And what's the instrument you're playing?
This is a dulcimer.
Is that one of the ones you made, or
yes, I did make this
you
one.
did make this one.
This is number 8, and it actually sounds fairly decent. It took 8 to get that way.
And you're sitting here helping out at the book sale at the library.
Yep, I'm staying unbored by playing this thing. I'm sitting here for hours. That's the very first song anybody learns on a dulcimer.
Is it?
It is.
Have you been getting a lot of people asking you about it?
Yes, a lot. And there were 2 people here that were music majors, and they got right into the different sounds it can make.
Neat.
This string is like D above middle C on the keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
And this is D 1 octave higher.
Oh,
with A in the
okay.
middle.
All right. Well,
Yes.
thank you.
It's fun. It's
Yeah,
easy.
it looks fun, and it's very beautiful.
And it's easy. Well, thank you. This piece of wood
Yes.
came from a pallet that we had something delivered on.
Really?
It was just so nice.
So you don't have to buy special woods or anything?
Well, this dulcimer I have maybe $35 into.
Uh-huh.
That's for the tuners and the strings. And the wood, this was a 1x6 piece of cherry wood from Menards.
Oh, okay.
And it was a few bucks.
And you
And-
had to soak it and bend it? Is that how it...
Oh, that's how, yeah, I got the sides.
Yeah.
So I had to cut it down to the real thin
Wow.
width. Just a lot of work. But this is, you know, 25, 35 bucks.
Uh-huh.
And Peggy has one she paid $650 for, and she got a deal on it.
Wow.
So I'm really cheap.
But you're thrifty, not cheap.
No, I'm just downright cheap. I won't go for the expensive stuff.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, while we're on our way to this first stop here, this photograph taken, I believe, sometime in the mid-1880s of the Clegg operation down on the hill.
Oh.
It's a nice photograph because it represents the time. It's not just a building, it's got equipment and so forth in the yard that they built there at the Clegg operation.
And if you can identify any person standing there,
I can
feel
identify one person for sure, and
Can you
maybe
really?
2, yes. The
Really?
person standing in the middle with his hands on his hips like this is Tom Clegg. Because I have a picture, a wedding picture of Tom Clegg taken probably within 3 years of that picture. So by comparing the wedding picture to my computer enlargement of that picture, that guy with his hands on the hips is Tom Clegg.
Wait a minute, I got 3 guys with their hands on their hips.
Okay, the guy in the middle. That guy right there.
Right, yeah,
down
okay.
Front, down front. That's
Okay.
Tom Clegg.
And
Right
the other
there.
2 are his brothers.
And
okay.
and I think that the person behind him to his left with the black hat on, I think that would be or should be his father, John Clegg.
Oh, okay.
Because if I owned the business and somebody's coming to take a photo of my business, I get all my pictures, my people out front, but I don't go hide in the background.
Right.
I get right down front and center because I'm the guy that owns this business.
True.
And so I believe that the guy with the hat on is John Clegg, and the guy with his hands on his hips is his son, Tom Clegg.
Very good.
On these pictures, this barn back here didn't have a roof in the picture. It had a roof, but the sunlight whitened it right out so that in the picture you couldn't see the roof. You could see a line across the top, the ridge line, but you couldn't really see the roof.
Okay.
So we took the roof from this building over here and we put it on that building over there.
Really?
Yes.
So that's like
now-
that photo crop and all that
Well,
stuff.
yeah, right. And so we were able to rebuild this picture the way it would have been if it was taken today, you know,
Okay.
with the camera equipment today.
Sure.
But back then we lost the roof on this building.
In other words, you can change history no matter. to the way you want it.
Well, you can. Yes, you can.
Wow.
You can modify the picture. You can.
Oh.
You can remove Tom Clegg if you'd like from this picture, but you don't do that.
No.
But you do try to restore what was really there. You know?
Yeah. I'll be darned.
As some of you may know, this monument sign here beside the bus was placed there in 1985 by the state of Michigan in recognition for the invention and building of the first self-propelled passenger vehicle in Michigan. Okay, and the state came and put that sign in, and there was a a photo shoot and all that when it took place, but that was put there in 1985 by the state. And we were able to put that in that picture that you just looked at. That's one of the neat things about the computer. I'd like to tell you first about John Clegg, the father, then a little bit about Tom Clegg, the son, and about their business, and then about the vehicle that they built. Okay, so we'll kind of go in that order. And John Clegg, he was born in 1837 in England.
Huh. Do you mind sitting back down?
Sitting back down.
I lost
your head.
I lost you because of the light.
Oh my gosh.
You just like turned totally dark.
Camera.
So.
Hey, that'd be all right. I don't need to be in that picture at all.
Thank you.
So, okay, John Clegg then, he was born in England in 1837. And he got married there in England when he was age 23. And he worked in a foundry machine shop kind of business in England. And that's where he learned the skills of the trade to do that kind of work. And so he emigrated to Canada a year later after he was married. He was 24 when he immigrated to Canada. And then he came to Detroit 1 year later. Came to Detroit, 25. And then he came to Pontiac, and he was in Pontiac. He moved to Pontiac when he was 27. And then he left Pontiac when he was 31. He was there in Pontiac for 4 years, and he left Pontiac, and he came to the Memphis area, 4 miles west of Memphis, and he ran a sawmill business 4 miles west of Memphis at age 31. And then he came to Memphis, right here to this house, which existed at the time. He came here, he and his wife and their only son, Tom Clegg, came to that house in 1870. And then he built several buildings on this land which he owned behind the house, east of the house. He built several buildings, and you saw those in that picture I passed around. And one of those buildings was a foundry building where he could take raw material and heat it and melt it and form it into an ingot or a block that he could then take to his machine shop, and he could machine it into the shape and size that he needed for the part that he needed. Okay, and so with that skill, he was able to build farm equipment. Farm equipment that he built in the 1870s was pulled by horses or oxen. There were things like plows and land rollers and cultivators and the like. Okay, then in the 1880s, he began to purchase steam engines from a place in Port Huron. And he put the steam engines on the farm equipment that he built. Some of that equipment were tractors, some were thrashers, and other type of equipment that needed a power, needed motor. Okay, and he built those kind of machines in the 80s. Okay, as opposed to ones that were only horse-drawn equipment. As I mentioned, he learned those skills in England. And that's why he was able to do that right here in Memphis, because that's the skills he had. His son, Tom, was born in Canada. That 1 year he spent in Canada where he immigrated from England, his son Tom was born, and Tom moved with the family to those places that I've mentioned. Tom married in Memphis in 1887 when he was 24. That's 2 years after they built the passenger vehicle. Tom married and lived in that house with his wife until 1936. Okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, John Clegg ran his business making these farm equipments that were pulled by horses, and then in the 80s he went into steam-powered engine farm equipment. And Tom worked there with his father, and that's how he learned the skills about doing those type of work. In his late teens, in the mid-1880s, Tom began to think about making a self-propelled passenger vehicle. And he made sketches and so forth about how this would be, what parts he needed to do this, and he asked his father to work with him and help him build this vehicle. And his father declined to do this because his father was in the business of making farm equipment and selling farm equipment to make a living, okay? But in the winter of 1884, 85, in that period, John Clegg decided that he would work with his son and build this passenger vehicle because he wanted his son to follow in his footsteps in the foundry machining business. And he thought, if we get something together here, we'll build on that goal that he had, okay? And so they built the vehicle in the winter of 84, 85. And during 85, Tom Clegg said in an interview with the Portland Times-Herald people in the 1930s that he thinks that they made 30 to 50 trips around with that vehicle in the summer, and they made several trips to Emmett, which their farthest trips. He estimates they probably put 400 to 500 miles on that vehicle that they built. Now that vehicle had a lot of resemblance to a piece of farm equipment, as you might imagine, because that's the business they were in. The rear wheels, or the drive wheels of the vehicle, were said to be 5.5 feet high, and they were all iron. The front wheels smaller and iron. The front wheels somehow were linked up with some kind of spring mechanism, and the vehicle, it's described as having a vertical steering column wheel, and this wheel was able to compress and expand those springs, and that prevented steering of the front wheels so that it could make some turns and maneuvers, okay? The vehicle was powered by a single-cylinder steam engine from Port Huron, and this steam engine required a furnace in order to heat the water, it required a boiler to hold the water, and it required a person to put coal in the furnace about every mile of travel and water in the boiler about every 3 miles of travel. So the vehicle held 4 people. One is going to be the driver. One is going to be the guy who feeds the coal and the water to the system. And the other 2 can be passengers. And on the 4th of July of 1885, Tom Clegg and his helper, the guy that put the coal in and the water in, took a trip to Emmett for the 4th of July parade in Emmett. And they picked up a priest from the church and a teenager as their 2 passengers, and they paraded back and forth down the main street in Emmett on the 4th of July. Later that year, the engine was removed from this vehicle and sold to a creamery in Port Huron because Tom Clegg was in the business of making farm equipment and he needed money. So he sold the engine to get money. The car was just set aside in storage someplace on the property, and there isn't any good written history that I found about what really happened to the remains of the car. Were pieces of it used to make other equipment, or did it just rust away? there isn't any good description of what really happened, you know. John Clegg, the father, died 2 years after they made the car in 1887, and he was only 52 years old. And Tom continued on, as his father would have wanted, continued on in that business here. And as time went by, and we began to get motor vehicles and by many other people, the foundry business kind of died off, and the farm equipment business made by little independent makers kind of dried up. And so the foundry building was torn down, was removed, and the machine shop was converted into a repair garage. And Tom's business was repairing farm equipment and repairing motor vehicles. He was in fact a repair garage, is what he was. And he ran that until 1936, when he closed it down, and he sold the house, the property, and the remaining buildings to a Memphis person named Carl Van Antwerp. And Carl Van Antwerp tore down the garage, which had been the old machine shop, and the other buildings out there, removed them all. And about 2 years later, Henry Ford I sent a couple of people here to Memphis with the goal of purchasing the building from Tom Clegg and moving it to Greenfield Village, but it had been torn down. So in 1939, 3 years after he closed his business, Tom Clegg died here in Memphis. In 1887, 2 years after Clegg did his vehicle, a guy in Lansing named Ransom Olds had heard about Clegg and what he did, and they had some correspondence, he and the Cleggs, about how they made this and how it worked, you know. 2 years later, Ransom Olds built a single-cylinder steam-powered engine and drove it around the streets of Lansing. It wasn't until until 1896 that this same guy, Ransom Olds, got a gasoline engine. Now the problem with gasoline engines is they had them in the 80s, but they ran so poorly they were virtually not used for anything. They ran well if the fuel tank was above the engine and a hose came down to a device, we'll call it a carburetor, where the fuel got mixed with air and taken into the engine. Well, when the tank above the engine was half full of fuel, the carburetor was adjusted for that condition, the engine ran pretty well. But if you filled the tank up more, or if the tank ran low, the engine ran poorly. So for that reason, the carburetor problem, these engines just weren't practical, they weren't workable. But in the mid-90s, somebody invented a thing called the needle and seat and the float, and they incorporated that in the carburetor as a system. And that solved the fuel problem. You could put the tank virtually anywhere, and the needle and seat with the float managed the amount of fuel that was available for the engine. After that invention, the steam engines were out, gasoline engines were in. And in 1896, Ransom Olds in Lansing built his first vehicle with a gasoline engine and drove it around Lansing. And a year later, in 97, Henry Ford built his first vehicle with a gasoline engine and drove it around Detroit. So that's the summary of the Cleggs here in Memphis, where they came from and what they did, and a little bit about how they did it. And a hand in the air for the audience.
Is Mr. Clegg buried in our cemetery?
He is. Yes, he is. And his wife, both Cleggs, and their wives. Okay. Well, I think we're ready to move to the second stop. So we'll turn the bus around and
turn that air back on so we
head
can
back
breathe
to
through
the
the next.
picture of a house you're all familiar with, known as the Watchtower House.
Oh.
You might
Mrs.
notice
Avery's.
that the back of that house has got an attachment to it that's a story and a half, where the front of the house is a two-story house. You can just see the roof of the top of the story and a half in the back. And then on the side, the right side, which would be the south side of the house, is the one-story extension of the house.
Because this goes south.
So there's
It was over on its original piece of property. Okay, because I realized I could see the water tower in the background. Okay.
Hold it right here.
Oh, it's right here.
Sorry, I didn't tell you. We need to back up about 50 feet.
Yes, that was. He does. Yep.
it isn't white anymore.
The house. Yeah.
We'll stay right here. Thank you. This is a good spot. This house, known as the Watchtower House, because of the tower on the roof, called the cupola. It's been called the Watchtower House because some said that back when this house was built, people would go up the stairway, which leads to the cupola, and look out the windows on all four sides and watch to see if there were any hostile Indians that might be coming to attack in the town of Memphis. And it got its name, the Watchtower House, based on that theory. This house was built by Azariah J. Ashley in June of 1854 on the corner of Potter and Main Street. We see it there on the 1859 Memphis map. Azariah Ashley was a businessman in Memphis, and he owned a flour mill on this street that was across the street from Clegg's and a little bit east. According to the 1859 map, it's where Azariah Ashley's flour mill was located. It was driven by steam, steam engine-driven flour mill. This road, now called Boardman Road, on the 1859 map is named A.J. Ashley Street. After, in the second half of the 1800s, a businessman in town, Orrin Granger, lost his wife, and he remarried Sarah Ashley, Azariah Ashley's daughter. And through that marriage, Orrin Granger acquired the house, and that's where he lived. We know he lived there in 1883. We have writings that say he did. He died in 1901, and his wife continued to live there until she died in 1911. And at that time, the house was sold to a lady. Her name was Mrs. Stroke. And she installed a better furnace, and she enlarged the basement. Those are the two things she did to the house. Before she sold it in 1916, after she had it for 5 years, or 4 years, she sold it to a Mrs. Hayes. Now, Mr. Hayes, he existed too, and so did Mr. Stroke. But it seemed like back in those days, properties were recorded as owned by the lady, the Mrs. She owned the properties. The man didn't own any properties. He was the businessman. So if he got sued in his business for something he did, his property was separate. That was owned by his wife. So he tried to protect his property. That's what I have found, that properties in that era were owned always by the lady, you know. So anyway, Mrs. Hayes is shown as the owner of the property in 1916. She kept it till 1926 when she sold it to George Freeze and his wife, Mrs. Freeze. In 1926, they did major remodeling of that house. They installed an inside bathroom. And there was then village water in 1926, which permitted an inside bathroom that operated like a bathroom, okay? And they installed an entirely new heating system in the house. While the prior owner installed a new furnace, I would think the heating system remained the same, just a new furnace. But now the Freezes installed a new system, which could have been a hot water heating system that went all through the house and so forth. We don't know that, but it could have been. That would have been a system. The Freezes owned the house for about 10 years, and they sold it to Ralph Will. Ralph Will's father was an undertaker in New Haven, and Ralph Will had learned the trade from his father. Ralph's brother, Russell Will, owned a meat market here in Memphis and a slaughterhouse. So I assume that through the operations of his brother, Russell Will, Ralph Will knew about Memphis. And maybe that was one of the reasons he came here when he went into the undertaker business for himself. He bought this house somewhere around the late 30s. Was here for about 3 years in this house when it was on the corner of Main and Potter, and ran his undertaker business from the house, and he lived there in the house. After 3 years, he buried so many children that he just couldn't stand the emotions of the undertaker business. So he left the undertaker business, left the house, and went into business partners with his brother Russell. Okay? The house was then bought by Dr. Dewey, who came to Memphis in 1937, but wasn't in this house. He bought the house about 1940 from Ralph Will. And he moved his medical practice here, and he lived in the house until the mid-60s when he closed down his practice and retired. And the house was sold to a couple by the name of Agassi, something like that, who opened a restaurant in the house, which operated for about 2 years. And after that, a real estate office went into the house, and probably others, until the mid-90s, when the Foster Oil Company from Richmond bought the property and advertised that they would sell the house for $1 with the condition that the house would be moved off the property because they wanted to construct a gasoline station, party store arrangement. And so John Shafransky bought the house, and in 1999 the house was moved to this location. In order to move the house, they had to remove the story-and-a-half addition that had been installed many years before to make it practical. That addition was not put back on. But the side addition was, as you see it here, the half-story, or the one-story on the side, was moved with the house, or it was put back on, whichever way it was. Now, to come back to the cupola on the roof, which caused this house to be named the Watchtower House, because they went up there to watch for the hostile Indians coming. Well, I learned when I was taking a tour through a city in South Carolina, we came upon houses with the tour guide that were of this type of house, and they had a cupola on the roof, and I said to my wife, I wonder what they were watching for. And the tour guide heard me say that and asked me what I meant. And I said, well, we had a house with a cupola in my town, and they went up there to watch for hostile Indians. And she about laughed out loud, and she said, well, she said, you'll find those cupolas on many large houses built in the 80s in the South. And what they were for was to let the hot air out. The owner would send people up there on the stairway that goes to the cupola, and this house has a stairway to the cupola. They would remove the windows from all four sides, and they would open the windows on the lower level of the house, and the hot air would rise up through the house and escape through the cupola. And that was the purpose of the cupola, and I suspect that that was the purpose of the cupola on this house, because I've never read anything about hostile Indians in Memphis at any time.
I bet you're right.
So that's the story, the real story, the rest of the story about the Watchtower House. We're ready to move on to the hotel. Nice picture of the Memphis Hotel as it was originally built, before any modification had been made to it.
And who's the guy in front of it?
That's Mr. Hotel.
Mr. Hotel himself.
It was called the National Hotel when it was built, and it remained with that name until around 1940, around that period. Up to then, it was always the National Hotel. Okay.
I think he's from the Super family.
As you see in the photo, the National Hotel was built with 3 stories. On the first story, it contained the tavern and the dining room and the kitchen and later bathrooms after the water was put in. Okay, that was the first story. On the second story was all the lodging rooms where people rented to spend the night. On the third story, there were no lodging rooms. There was only a hardwood floor. And it was built for parties and ballroom dancing. And if they sold out all the rooms on the second floor, and there were more people who needed lodging, they would put down mattresses on the hardwood floor and rent that space out for the overflow capacity. This hotel has nearly a full basement. Although the basement has a dirt floor and it's only about 5 feet deep, maybe a little more in spots, but it has nearly a full basement. Behind the hotel, there was a building, as you may have saw in the picture, built on the back, some kind of a storage utility building for the hotel. It was only 1-story building. Then behind the building, further, was a water tower with a water tower storage tank. The water tower was powered by the wind, had a windmill on the top of it, and had mechanical linkage that went down to a pump that went into the well. So when the wind blew the windmill and it turned the pump, and it pumped the water, and it pumped the water up into the steel storage tower. In that picture I passed around, you can just see the corner of the storage tower on the right side of the picture. In 1908, they added a front porch to this hotel, and it was a real architectural enhancement of the hotel. The front porch joined the building, which supported it on the one side, and on the outside it was supported by 5 round columns, and it had no sides. It was all open all around except for these 5 columns on the outer side, and the back side was attached to the hotel wall. That was in 1908. They added that porch. The door going in, the left door, went into the tavern as it does now. The right door, which would be at the right end of the porch, okay, now in about the middle of the building, well, still at the right end of the porch that they have there. The right door, when you go in, you have to go to your left about 3 feet, and there are the stairs going up to the second floor. And there were stairs going up to the 3rd floor, but there aren't now. They've been removed. There was also another set of stairs which was in the kitchen, which was at the east end of the 1st floor. And that second set of stairs, they go to the 2nd floor and the 3rd floor. and they were utility stairs for people who worked at the hotel. That's how they would traverse up and down rather than go through the stairways used by the patrons, the people who were staying there. Okay? In this basement, it's nearly a full basement, over in the southwest corner of the basement are the partial remains of 2 stone walls, approximately 18 inches thick, constructed with boulders that they must have gotten from the fields around the area and mortar. The walls are broken away, both of the walls are broken away, so you can see these boulders in there of how they built these walls. It is said that this about 8-foot square room had steel bars. The walls went up about halfway to the ceiling, and the remaining distance was filled in with steel bars. And there were also a doorway to this little room made of steel bars. And this room was a holding cell, where if you had an unruly person in the town, they would take this person and put him in the cell, the holding cell in the basement of the hotel, and keep him there until the justice of the peace showed up and could decide what to do with this person. So it was a holding cell.
About what time? Like, about what year was that?
Well, it went up to 1898 when Memphis got its first jail.
Okay.
First jail was on the 2nd floor of the fire hall. The fire hall was located just east of where the school bus garage is now. On the 2nd floor was Memphis' first jail. So in the basement of the hotel was sort of the jail, but it was really more of a holding place for several days where you would keep the occupant until the justice showed up. In 1962, when the hotel was set on fire, it took 3 tries for the arson to get it to burn. First try went out, second try was in the mattress, and it smoked and smoldered, and smoke was discovered, and the Memphis fire people came and put the fire out. And the third time the arsonist lit the fire, it was successful, it went, and it took Richmond, Emmett, and Memphis fire departments here to prevent the building from burning to the ground. They lost the 3rd story. The ballroom dancing story was gone. So the owners decided to put the roof over the 2nd story. But when you go up there now, up those utility stairs to the 3rd floor, the ballroom hardwood floor is still there. Although the height from the floor to the bridge is maybe 5 feet, so it could only be used as a utility storage area. You really couldn't do anything up there because of the low ceiling. But the floor, the hardwood floor, is still there from one end to the other. The person who lit the fire, the arsonist, as was determined by state inspectors and evidence of arson, the person was in a dispute. He lived in the hotel, but he was in a dispute with the hotel management. And so right away they suspected that he was the one. And so he was arrested by the town marshal, Earl Clark, and prosecuted as the arsonist of the Memphis Hotel. I don't know what happened to him, but he was arrested and prosecuted. And we do know his name.
He's still in the basement.
That's what I was
He
going
could
to say.
be in the basement,
Still in the room.
in the holding cell waiting for the justice.
Yes.
And what was his name?
I forget. Oh, I do. I forget his name. He was 52 years old, I remember that. But anyway, I forget his name. So that's the story today of the Memphis Hotel. Questions from the audience?
I've heard that you were talking about the jail being there and then over by the bus garage. I've heard that there's jail cells or remnants of jail cells in the basement of Jessica Jordan, is that correct?
I've never been in that basement. I don't know. I would like to go in that basement because the Jessica Jordan building is the oldest brick building that we have in Memphis. Believed to be built around 1880. So as a brick building, it's the oldest building. This is the oldest commercial building. There are people in town who believe their house is a few years older than this building, but this is the oldest commercial building. Okay, that's a story about the Memphis Hotel. We can move on up to Church Street, which is the first street to the right after you cross the main street. Pictures. The first picture you're going to receive is the first Methodist church that was built here in Memphis on the corner of Church and Maple Street. That's the first one. That's an 1883 photograph. That church was remodeled into the second picture I'm going to pass around here. And the land for the church was donated by a member of the church. But it was free, but it had a stipulation that came with it. The church that was to be built must be at least 30 feet by 50 feet, and it must have a steeple, a large steeple. And as you can see by the second photograph, it did receive a large steeple. If you would pull up to the corner and back in, this morning we backed in and hung over by the right near the truck.
All the steeples gone. I bet that church burned down. Every 5 years when that one calendar was
Pictures. The first picture, the original church. As you may know, this place, Memphis, when it was first settled, was called Wells Settlement, for the James Wells family, who are given credit as the first family to settle in this area. The first religious service in this settlement was done by a sanctioned Methodist minister. Her name was Abigail Chilson. And she held that service in 1837 in James Wells' house. And all families in town were invited to attend. Over the next 2 years, Mrs. Chilson, minister, conducted services in the first school in Memphis. It was a single-room log school. It was built on the northeast corner of Bell River and Boardman. There's a house that's for sale on that corner now. That was the location of the first school in Memphis. It was made of logs and it was one room. And it was there in 1837. And Mrs. Chilson began to preach on Sunday. The first Methodist class of church, because there was no church building and there was no property, so it was just a defined organization consisting of about 8 families, was put together in 1839 so that Methodist worship could take place in Memphis. That's why you see the banner out in front there. It says we're celebrating 175 years of ministry, because ministry began officially, formally, in 1839. Although they didn't have a building. So they held their Sunday meetings across the street here on this property, which contained then a log school of a larger room. It was called the North School. And it was here about where the house is today. okay? So the Methodist Church began meeting in the log school across the street. Before long, all of the families in Memphis who wanted to participate in church services on Sunday arrived at the log school, and they had an interdenominational service on Sundays in that school. And over the next 18 years, there grew to be 200 members of the interdenominational church. Now, they all didn't show up every Sunday, but those that did show up overfilled the log school, and they had to find another place. And so they went to an empty hardware store at the end of Church Street on the south side of Boardman Road. And they met there while the various churches began to build their own buildings. Now, there was already a congregational building, during that time, during that 18 years. And so the congregational people could be independent except when they decided to build a new church. Then they were welcome to come to the Methodist Church, as everybody was who lived here, and they had interdenominational services, in the log school, I meant. Okay. In 1858, recognizing that the log school was overflowing and the hardware was about to, the Methodist Church set out to build their own first church building. The property was donated by a man and his wife who were members of the Methodist Church, and they had that stipulation that the building had to be at least 30 feet wide and 50 feet deep, and it had to have a large steeple. That was stipulated. And so that church began to be built in 1858 and was dedicated in 1863. Now, they held services there before 1863, but the final detailing and trimming of the church didn't take place till 1863, and that's when it was dedicated as the Methodist Church. Okay, and that was the church in the first photo that you looked at. Okay.
Yep.
In 1894, that church was remodeled significantly, and that was the second church that you looked at in the photo, with an even larger belfry tower on the top. Okay, that was in 1894. In 1911, there was a strong windstorm out of the north. It blew the belfry tower off the roof of the church. It blew in the north wall of the church. It damaged the structure of the church, and the church needed to be rebuilt as a result of the 1911 windstorm. Over the next 3 years, services were held in empty stores in town until the church could be rebuilt, reconstructed. I'm going to pass around a picture of the reconstructed church. Remember the church that had its belfry blown off. We can see by the size of the belfry, it's no doubt it would be easy to blow it off, Well, when that church was rebuilt after losing the belfry and damaging the north side, they ended up with this church. So this is the church that was dedicated in 1914. As you can see from the photo, they didn't put the belfry back on the roof. They made its own structural foundation and put it beside the church. And it was all brick, but underneath that brick is mostly this old church, pieces of it that weren't damaged. It's underneath that brick. Well, that church that was dedicated in 1914, or 1814, pardon me, 1914, stood as the Methodist Church until 1936. And during the winter of 1936, there was a fire that is thought to have begun in the basement of that church. brick church. And in spite of the efforts of the Richmond Fire Department and the Memphis Fire Department, they were unable to save the church. And the church was totally destroyed by the 1936 fire. So once again, the Methodist Church had to begin and decide how they were going to recover. And they found there was an opportunity to have a church building that was vacant, was not being used, and it was located at the corner of Mare Road and Rattle Run Road near Gratiot. This church was empty and available, and so the Memphis congregation obtained that church. They disassembled part of it, and they had the rest of it moved from Rattle Run Road over to here, to this spot. And they set it on the spot where the brick church was that had burned down. And there are some bricks in the front lawn here where the downspout comes out that stick out of the ground from the foundation of the previous church, the one that burnt down. The one they brought here from Rattle Run is the one you see here now. And it was a little smaller on the footing than the one that burnt down, so the bricks of the other one are sticking out. Over the years, 2 additions were made to this church, one on the south side, one on the north side. We can see the north side addition from here, but the fundamental church in the middle is the church that was moved here from Rattle Run and it was dedicated in 1937. The second Methodist parsonage house was the Blue House here on the left. That was purchased by the Methodist Church in 1837. And that parsonage was used until it was thought to be not large enough for visiting guests to the church. And so that house was traded with some money for the brick house that's located to the west of the Methodist Church, the first brick house. And that is the parsonage that occurred in 1925 and is used up to today. So that's the history comment about the Methodist Church in Memphis. Any questions from the audience?
Was it really that much more cost effective way back then to move the church in and put it on the foundation rather than just build another one?
Well, I haven't access to any financial numbers, so I don't really know how to define the economics, but it was either the cost or the timing with regard, or maybe a combination of both that caused that decision to be made to move the church and put it in place, because they did it in a year. They had placed this church here. They had, rebuilt what they needed to that had been lost in the move, and dedicated it in a 1-year period. Okay, we are ready to go to the next stop. I'm going to stop calling it the mill.
Sit on my side.
It's the Memphis elevator. The biggest question, and maybe the only question about this elevator, has been, when was it built? Nobody seemed to know when this elevator was built. We in the Historical Society didn't know, but we kept watching for clues. And we knew from the railroad pictures that it wasn't here in the 1890s, but we didn't know when it was here. And so as time went on, some clues did show up, and one of the first clues was the 1896 Memphis map that we discovered. And these maps back then were called plat maps. Plat maps because they didn't have dimensions on them as to how big your lot was, but they showed the shape of your lot, and they had your name printed right in the middle of it. So we knew who owned it and where it was located next to other lots. The 1896 map shows the owner of this property to be a Memphis person who we knew about, and it does not show any buildings. It's just a vacant piece of land. The 1905 tax records, about 10 years later, show that the land is owned by the Richmond Elevator Company, and there is a small hay shed located on the land, and the tax on the hay shed was $3. The 1909 photo that we have, taken from Church Street in Maple, in the backyard of Al Morgan's property, looking down over the valley and toward where this building is, showed this building was not here in 1909. It shows the lumber yard. It shows a very small building, the hay shed, but there's no elevator here. It's just a pasture land. We can see the railroad track running by. That's a 1909 photo. In July of 1912, I discovered an article in the Richmond Review newspaper, July of 1912, and it says, "New elevator to be built in Memphis. The land has been secured. Construction has begun, and the owners are two businessmen from Richmond." That was 1912. On February 7th, 1913, there was another article in the Richmond Review newspaper, and it announced the operation of the new Memphis elevator, February 1913. In 1913 also, the Memphis tax record shows a substantial increase in property value over the 1911 tax. We don't have the 1912 record. The 11 is one value and the 13 is many times more value. So that supports the article in the Richmond Review that this building was in fact built during the second half of 12 and went into operation in 13. The review article said that the first item to be processed here was a load of beans, and it said they went through successfully. All the mechanisms worked as they should. It said the elevator workings were installed and made to operate by John Cook out of Detroit, and he is identified as an expert millwright. To me, a millwright is somebody who works with machinery of various sorts. He said, taken as a whole, it is one of the best built and most up-to-date elevators in this section of the state. 1913. There's 2 floors of equipment in the building at the time. Cook says all machinery can be operated from the first floor. You don't need to go upstairs to turn it on. You can turn it on from the first floor. The machinery was powered by 2 electric motors, so he says. And he further says that the building will have electric lights throughout. 1913. He says the cost of completing the plant, as he calls it, will approach $7,000. And the article in the paper concludes that having an elevator like this is a big boost for Memphis industry. The Pierre Marquette Railway Company changed their rail tracks to where not only does the tracks pass right straight through to the railway depot and so forth across the road, they put in new tracks beginning just beyond the depot and coming back this way as a railway siding, as they call it. And that siding ran right up tight with the north side of this building. So they could take rail cars off the main track and side them in the siding for unloading and loading purposes. And when they were ready, then the engine could pull them back onto the main track and couple them up with the other cars and take them away. So the Pierre Marquette put in that rail siding in support of this elevator. And for safety purposes, the elevator has a cupola on the highest roof because it's been known for many years that the combination of high air temperature and dust can lead to an explosion should a spark occur. So they're running electric machinery in here, and they got a lot of dust from processing the grain, and they got high temperatures in the summertime, and that could lead to an explosion. So the cupola, when we take the windows out, now we can let the dust and the hot air rise up out of the building, just like in the house.
Kind of supports that theory, huh?
Yes. This elevator was privately owned by the two Richmond people when it opened, and they continued to own it to 1921. And in 1921, it shows that the ownership was changed to the Farm Bureau Company, and the Farm Bureau owned it for 2 years. In 1924, it became the Memphis Co-op, according to the tax records. And the co-op, being a group of people got together and purchased shares in a business, and the money they paid for their shares was used to buy the business. And then profits from the business were distributed each year as dividends to those people who own shares in the company. So it operated as a co-op from 1924 until it was sold in 1967. And during most of that period, at least for sure in 1928 through 1967 when it was sold, Ralph Chapman was the manager of the co-op. This elevator is the second oldest commercial business in Memphis, the first being the hotel that we saw, and this elevator is the second oldest. Now the drugstore building is older, built in 1907, but it hasn't always been a drugstore. It became a drugstore in 1911, before this became an elevator. But in the early 20s, it stopped being a drugstore and became an automotive parts store. And it stayed that way for about 6 years till it went back to being a drugstore. So it had a 6-year interruption as a drugstore, which disqualifies it from the definition of being the oldest building with the same type of business for all those years. So this is the oldest building with the same business for all those years.
In 1967, when it sold, does it say who it sold to? As a private owner, did someone buy it? Or
It's my understanding that it sold to a partnership between Norm Collinger and Bob
Robert
Henikowski.
Yep. That's what I thought.
They partnered and,
Yes.
and bought this building. And then later Norm Collinger bought out Bob, and he's the sole owner. Okay, that's the story on the Memphis elevator. Another question from the audience.
So, is it still a working elevator or no? They just bring in, it is.
Yeah, they're still working. Absolutely.
They
It's
still
in
bring
business.
in whatever it is they do, and they do it and they send it out.
grind and process feed, and I know they bring in loads of corn from Gombieski's sometimes, and grind the corn and
You'll
make
see
feed.
them on Sundays. They'll have them under the
Yeah.
drive-through there, taking the corn off and cracking it and doing whatever, and then
Because Mike will bring loads in, and then as they process it and resell it, then they pay for the loads.
I see.
Yeah, so. Cool.
See, that was an elevator business back in the day, where the elevator cooperative or the elevator privately owned business, whichever it would be, purchased grain from the farmer, and they processed the grain. I mean, if it was beans, they took the husks off the beans and so forth, and they stored the beans in bins. The elevator took the grain up and dumped it in the bins, called the elevator. Okay? So they had multiple bins in this building, second floor, first floor, for being able to store processed grain. So they bought processed grain. The elevator company actually bought processed grain when it was harvest, when the price was lower. They stored it until the following year when there was a shortage of grain in the spring and the early summer, and they sold then out of their reserves in these bins for a higher price, made money, distributed the money to the shareholders of the corporation. So it was an elevator business to make money. That's how they made it. And the fact that they have equipment here that they can grind and mix and so forth just enhances their business. But to start with, it wasn't a mill like a flour mill. It was an elevator mill. Okay, we're ready for the next stop. We're going to go south on Main Street, past the church.
And Kathy wants to take a tour all the way to the top.
Okay,
I've never been on there.
Oh, really?
This is a great.
No, I got my sandwich. You didn't know.
Well, much earlier in 1919, the property that this house is on extended up and included the new construction at the Catholic Church, but it did not include the property that the Catholic Church is on. But the new construction was on the original property that this house is on. In 1916 shows that there was a house in this spot. It was owned by a family whose name was Phillips, 1916. In 1919, a person from St. Clair Shores named Ed Birch bought the Phillips property and the house. And it was his plan that he was going to remodel the old wooden house into a summer home for himself. However, sometime between 1919 and 1920, he changed his mind, and in 1920 he tore down the Phillips house and built this house virtually in the same spot that the Phillips house was built. Okay. He built this house, and it was built in 1920, the same time that they remodeled the Masonic Temple building. And it was written up in the paper, kind of like this is a construction that's going on in Memphis, and they described the construction of this house, how the walls were done and so on and so forth, and the roof was on and this and that. When this house was built, all the white brick that you see was medium red color, and the roof was a red tile, and the roof on the porch was red tile, with the white columns like they're there now. In the southeast corner of the second floor of this house, that's the back as we stand here, on the southeast corner is a large porch. It covers a third to a half of the length of the house, and it's got a brick wall about waist high around two sides of that porch, the other two sides being the house. On the first floor again of the house, on the northeast corner of the house, which would be to our left here, but in the back, was a single-story wing that originally built on this house, and that was the kitchen and a utility storeroom. that wing has been made longer now going east than it was originally when it was built. And the extension to the wing was done somewhere around the year 2000. This house has a partial basement. I've not been in the basement, but I'm speaking to people who have. It says it's a partial basement. When the house was built, and for many years it had a circle drive, you could go in to my right and circle down beside the house, along the back of the house, and come back out onto the street on this side of the house here on the left side. Okay? Circle drive. And at each point of the circle drive where it is at the road, we'll call that the entry and this the exit. At each point there was a brick pillar, 2 brick pillars, one on either side of the entry point that matched the bricks of the house. And they had a pitched roof or top on the pillars with a ridge brick going along it on the top. Those bricks were red just like the bricks on the house. And attached to those pillars was a wrought iron gate. So there was 2 swing gates, one on each pillar that could be closed off to shut off the driveway. And that arrangement existed on the entry on the right and the exit on the left. They had identical pillars, identical gates. There was a brick wall that went from the pillars on the left to the pillars on the right, brick wall. It was not as high as this wall. This wall is not the original wall. It was not as high as this wall. It was much more decorative than this wall. It had a sloped top on it, like a V, upside down V. A ridge brick down the top. And it was red brick, the same as the house. When this house was finished with all I've described, it was referred to by the residents of Memphis, the locals as I call them, as the Birch Mansion. And that's what I see in the old news clippings I read about the Birch Mansion. So we knew where they was, who they were talking about. In 1920, Birch purchased the adjoining property to the south, 68 acres, purchased when the farmer decided to stop farming. James Glaspie bought that land in 1870. He farmed it to 1920. And he ceased farming in 20, and he sold the 68 acres to Ed Birch. In 1925, Ed Birch bought this land across from the house, which ran all the way to Pratt Road at the time. And there was a few lots on Pratt, 3, and there were 3 or 4 lots at that time on Main Street, but excluding that, it was a rectangular piece of property consisting of 125 acres. Birch bought that in 1925. So, as a landowner in the village of Memphis, he was tied with 2 others for the most acreage owned. But considering the adjoining land that is in the township, but adjoined the Memphis land, he was by far the largest landowner with about 250 acres of land here. Birch died, well, before he died, Birch started the plowing contest. He had the first plowing contest in the area here. He offered $500 for the first prize, and he had 5 classes of plowing. A class for teenagers, a class for single horse, single plow, a class for a team of double plows, you know. He had 5 classes that pulled. There was winners in each class, you know. It's written up in the article that there were over 1,000 people attended the first plowing contest that Birch held in this land behind this house, okay? And he held it for at least 3 years. There was a Birch plowing contest. But after the first year, other townships began their own plowing contests. So he had competition after the first year. And I think probably horse plowing contests led to tractor pulling contests. Birch died in Florida, Palm Springs, Florida in 1933. And in 1935, Harold Donaldson bought all the property from the Birch estate. Donaldson was a very unusual person. At age 13, he went to Yale University and earned a degree in engineering from Yale University. He worked for Ford Motor Company for quite a number of years, left there and went to work for an automotive supplier in management. But in the meantime, he had this property out here, and he hired people who lived in the tenant house on the Glasgow property that he had purchased here. And they did the farm work that he wanted done. And he came out here from time to time to oversee the operations. That was Harold Donaldson. Well, Harold Donaldson retired here in 1952, and he became a gentleman farmer at that time, and the farming kind of got less and less and less until the point that he built a golf course down here in the valley called the Twin Gates Golf Course. Donaldson died in 1969 at the age of 77. And Bob Donaldson, his only son, continued to live here in the house with his wife. Bob Donaldson died in 1992. During Bob Donaldson's tenure here, he sold most of the land that his father owned, okay? And when he died, Bob Donaldson died, his wife then sold the house, built another house up the street. And after that, it's been between then and now, between 92 and now, I think there's been 3 private owners that have owned this property. Since Donaldson was here for 57 years in name of Harold Donaldson and his son Bob Donaldson, I think this place will nearly always be thought of as the Donaldson House, no matter who lives here or no matter who built it. And that's the story of the Donaldson House. We're ready for ice cream, driver.
Probably for your pre-show, like nice stuff, then just some of the stuff that sometimes you see and comes through. Didn't know if you'd be interested in it.
Wow.
I know you get a lot of videos. So. Yeah. Get it in, get rid of it. All right. I will. How do I get it to you when I'm ready?
Okay.
My truck's here, just call over, we'll just transfer it into the truck.
So excited.
Hello.
Hi,
almost,
Pastor
almost
Mary.
done.
Yes. Bye.
Okay. In this corner, Rain Berman, who has been a longtime member of this church, has kept the history of this church alive for many, many years, and she's held on to it. And she's brought back newspaper artifacts and pictures from 175 years worth of ministry that has gone on, including pictures of the original church that was here. The original church burned down in 1936, and a church was purchased from Rattle Run out in Columbus and dismantled and remantled here, which is the church that we're standing in right now. There have been 172 ministers that have come into this church, 72 ministers in this church. I am the 72nd minister in this church so far. And it's been a ministry that has been alive and well in the Memphis community for 175 years. And on September the 6th, we will have a big celebration with many past ministers coming back to celebrate with us. And so we are going to invite anyone who would like to come and celebrate with us to please come on September the 6th at 4 o'clock. We'll be having a dinner, meeting with former pastors, and just having a grand old time. This is one of the staples of the church that was established in 1839 as a Methodist part of the circuit in the Romeo circuit to start with. So we are a proud Methodist, and we are glad to still be in this community, still be active in ministry, and still be able to be a part of everything new. Looking forward to another 175 years.